William, what is your prediction for 2024?
So as we get into 2024 and the election cycle heats up, we're seeing increasing concern that Trump may win the election. And he has promised, if he wins, to enact 60% tariffs on all goods coming into the US from China, in addition to 10% tariffs overall, all countries coming into the US. And this would cause an absolute logistical crisis. Supply chains flow along the path of least financial resistance. This is always the case. And so the amount of restructuring that we'll have to see in supply chains to account for this and to keep prices low for the American consumer will be just earth-shattering.
What do you foresee then some of the knock-on effects of that reality being?
The first one that I'm focused on is not what many people are thinking about, which is that a lot of nearshoring will have to occur, or that manufacturing capacity will be shifted from Vietnam or from China to Vietnam or from China to Mexico. What I see is this issue with the fact that tariffs do not apply to shipments which are de minimis. That is, they are $800 or less in value. And these are usually done by direct to consumer firms. Two great examples of which are Temu and Shein, as well as Alibaba and TikTok Shop. And these companies, which are trying to compete directly with our Amazons, our Walmarts, are not importing in bulk to warehouses in the US. Their supply chain involves air freight directly from China into the US. And their shipments, you'll actually see on their websites, they will not sell you orders that total over $800. You have to split that up separately. And people on the internet, particularly on TikTok, will post hacks about how you can use your neighbor's address to trick TikTok into, to trick Shein into selling you more than $800 worth of product, as long as you go and pick up the package next door when it arrives.
Just to step back a second for the listener that might not be familiar with what de minimis is. What is de minimis? When did it come into play? And why is that significant in the context of this conversation?
So de minimis is a concept that exists internationally, and every country has their own threshold for what goods are considered basically personal shipments and do not have to be taxed. And so in some countries, this is as low as a $10 value, and some it can be up to $1,000. For the US, it's a flat 800. Obviously, these values are subject to change. And so let me also back up to give you a sense of how vast this has gotten. According to a recent report by Reuters, Shein and Temu together send almost 600,000 packages a day to the United States. That was as of June 2023. So it turns out that if you combine them, Temu, Shein, Alibaba, and TikTok Shop are shipping nearly 11,000 tons a day into the US, the equivalent of 108 Boeing 777s.
How is that going to be impacted then by Trump presidency?
So all of a sudden, Amazon, Target, Walmart have to pay an additional 60%. This price gets passed on to the consumer for stuff that they import via maritime freight, stage in their warehouses, and sell. Meanwhile, none of those price increases are passed on to Shein, Temu, Alibaba, TikTok. And so they're already competitive. They get exponentially more competitive. So what this might mean is a serious focus on the de minimis issue overall. Perhaps that value is going to drop. Perhaps China will be restricted from any de minimis exemptions. I mean, this would sabotage American e-commerce. So I was also looking into sort of the history of tariffs a little bit, because it's sort of something that's happened in the background. And for both of our lifetimes, tariffs have been a very small part for the US tax income. At one point, tariffs were the main driver of federal income, and we're occasionally at 95% in US history, but we're usually between 25 and 60%. However, starting near World War I, that decline began as sort of globalization ramped up, and it's just continued ever since. Which is another interesting aspect of this trade war policy, is that it really emphasizes sort of a multipolar world. In a unipolar American hegemonic world, you have basically as low tariffs as possible to facilitate as much free movement of trade, because the profit is driven by the trade itself, not by competition and friction between nations.
It's interesting to see how that changes. And to your point about kind of the immediate and drastic impact these tariffs could potentially have, like it would make sense if this was done slowly over time in an effort to ramp up American manufacturing and production and for kind of prices to normalize to a certain extent. But I just can't imagine that supply is there.
Right. I mean, if there was some established plan to ramp this up percent by percent year over year to give companies time to shift their supply chains around, to begin doing nearshoring, et cetera, that would be a different thing. But this will be a very aggressive shock.
Which makes you question how much of it is kind of political conjecture versus actual conviction.
Well, the other thing to look at, though, is that the trade war tariffs from 2018 are still in effect. Biden has not repealed those. He's left them going. And corollary to that, we've got this data showing trade between Mexico and China. And between like roughly spring of 2020 and peaking late 22, but really not falling at all, that trade has essentially doubled. And this is both in terms of monetary value and number of shipments. Well, the number of companies involved has stayed roughly the same. So we're already seeing with this trade war issue, companies diverting stuff into Mexico, then to have, assembly, whatever. The nearshoring has begun.
Yeah, very much so. And the kind of rise of intermediate products being sold to these kind of quote unquote assembly houses that then subsequently ramps up their exports with America, places like India, Vietnam, Mexico. And
presumably some amount of parallel importing that is just trying to skirt the sanctions with that, or the tariffs, without doing any actual assembly. That must be occurring on some level, but we haven't been able to prove how extensive that is.
If I was to nail you down to a soundbite, then William, how do you think this whole thing is going to play out? What is your prediction for 2024?
I think a lot of people are going to be hearing a lot about de minimis, and it's an issue that people have really not had to think about previously.